7 days before the ground finally shook, nobody in the villages along the Valley River and the Nikwasi knew exactly what was coming, only that voices no one could see had told them to stop being afraid. The voices came from nowhere anyone could point to, warning of wars and misfortunes about to fall on the Cherokee, and inviting the people to come live under the mountain, where townhouses of an immortal people were said to have stood for centuries already, invisible unless they chose otherwise. More than one town in the same river country reported hearing the same kind of warning that same season, always with the identical instruction attached. The families who received the warning gathered, fasted, and waited in silence, because the voices had been specific about one thing. If anyone cried out in fear, whatever was being carried would be dropped. On the 7th day, a sound like thunder started somewhere in the distance and grew louder with every passing minute, until the earth itself began to shake. Someone couldn't hold the silence and screamed, and at that exact moment part of what was being carried was dropped, becoming a mound at a place called Setsi. The rest was carried on into a mountain called Lone Peak, and the people inside it became invisible for good. This is not a campfire story told to frighten children. It is a field record taken down by an ethnologist named James Mooney from Cherokee informants in the Valley River country in the late 1880s, describing an event dated to sometime before 1838, before the United States Army actually came for the people who were left behind. Once the real removal happened and most of the nation was already walking the Trail of Tears, the Cherokee kept repeating one specific regret for years afterward, not about the gold, not about the land, but about failing to make it under the mountain with the relatives they believed that same immortal people had already taken in. Since then, no mound in the old Cherokee mountains has ever been just a hill. What makes this account different from a simple ghost story is worth being precise about, because it would be easy to overstate it, the same way it would be easy to dismiss it. James Mooney lived among the eastern band of Cherokee in North Carolina from 1887 to 1890, collecting material for what would become Myths of the Cherokee, published in 1900 as part of the Bureau of American Ethnology's annual report, a government series that otherwise ran to census figures and land surveys. Much of what he recorded about these particular spirit people came through a storyteller named James Wofford, known among his own people as Tusquanunawata, a man who had spent years gathering and holding these accounts from other Cherokee before Mooney ever arrived. Mooney did not file the Nunnehi stories in the same section where he placed treaty dates and census counts, the way he later would with the gold rush. He kept them exactly where they belonged, among the sacred material, and he was careful never to claim they were literally true. But he was equally careful never to claim the opposite. The stories were treated by the Cherokee themselves the same way Mooney treated them in his notes, never confirmed, never denied, always repeated with the same seriousness reserved for sacred formulas rather than entertainment. Multiple informants, in different valleys, unconnected to each other, gave him the same mountains, the same townhouse locations, the same rules about invisibility. That kind of independent consistency is not what you expect from an invented story passed down for fun. It is what you expect from something a community had genuinely agreed, generations ago, not to argue about. The name itself carries the description. Nunnehi translates most directly as the people who live anywhere, sometimes rendered as the people who live forever, or simply the Immortals, and both versions were used interchangeably depending on who was telling the story. They were understood as a distinct category of being, not ghosts, not the small mischievous Yunweed Sunsdi that Cherokee tradition also describes, roughly the size of children and prone to playful tricks rather than rescue, but a full-grown, human-shaped people who happen to be permanent. Hunters in the high country reported hearing drums and dance songs coming from inside specific balds, the treeless mountain peaks scattered through the southern Appalachians, and when they climbed toward the sound, it would shift, moving behind them or off to another ridge entirely, so that the townhouse itself could never actually be found, no matter how many times a hunter tried to corner it. When the Nunnehi wanted to be seen, they looked and spoke exactly like ordinary Cherokee people, which meant an encounter with one of them could go completely unnoticed until it was already over. They were consistently described as friendly rather than dangerous, known for rescuing lost travelers in bad weather, warming and feeding them inside the mountain, and guiding them home again if the person chose to leave. That last detail carried more weight than it sounds like it should, because not everyone who was taken in chose to leave. The clearest proof the Cherokee ever offered that the Nunnehi were real came during a battle, not a rescue. An enemy force had been cutting through Cherokee towns in the mountains, destroying settlements as it moved and giving no warning of where it would strike next, until it reached Nikwasi, an old town on the Little Tennessee River that had already stood there for generations by the time the story is set. The defenders gathered their families into the townhouse and held the line as long as they could, but they were losing ground when a stranger appeared among them and told the chief to call his men back, saying he would drive off the enemy himself. From his dress and his speech, the Nikwasi warriors assumed he was reinforcement from an allied town further west. As they fell back near the mound, they watched an entire company of armed warriors emerge from the side of it, as if the mound itself had a door nobody had ever noticed. Only then did they understand who had actually come. The Nunnehi poured out by the hundreds, painted and armed, and once they crossed outside the settlement's edge, they turned invisible entirely. The attackers could feel arrows and blows landing on them from every direction, with no one visible to strike back at, and they broke and ran. The Nikwasi warriors had lived beside that mound their entire lives, without knowing what was underneath it. A state historical marker stands near the site today, identifying it only as the location of the old Cherokee town, with no mention of what the Cherokee themselves say actually happened there, which raises the obvious question about every other mound and every other bald peak the Cherokee ever pointed to and quietly refused to build on. Not every Nunnehi story is about war. Some are about the ordinary, almost domestic terms on which a person could simply disappear into that other life. A hunter named Yahulah became separated from his party in the mountains, and after a long search, days that stretched into weeks, his friends gave up and carried the news of his death back to the village. He was not dead. The Nunnehi had found him first, brought him into their townhouse, and he stayed there long enough that when he finally missed his family enough to go back and visit, there was already something different about him. His friends invited him to sit down and eat with them the way he always had, and he told them he could not, because he had already eaten the food of the Nunnehi, and once that happens, a person can never eat human food again. He explained what had happened to him, told them he had chosen to stay with his new people rather than return to the ordinary world of dying and aging, and asked them not to try to change his mind. Then he left again. He kept visiting afterward, regularly enough that people came to expect it. Always the same conversation, always the same refusal to stay, always returning to the mountain before dark. A man everyone had already grieved for kept walking back into his own village for years, healthy, unaging, and permanently unable to sit down to a normal meal with the people who loved him. What makes the Nunnehi accounts harder to wave off as a single travelling folktale is how specific and how repeatable the geography actually is. Informants across different valleys, telling their versions independently, kept naming the same handful of locations. Pilot Knob, overlooking the Nikwasi River country, held one of the largest townhouses. Blood Mountain, at the head of the Nunnehi River in what is now Georgia, held another. Nikwasi Mound itself, and the ancient site at Kituwa, considered by the Cherokee to be the very centre of the earth and the first of their mother towns, both carried the same association. These were not random hills chosen for dramatic effect. Every one of them was already significant to the Cherokee before the Nunnehi stories were ever attached to them, either as a sacred town site, a defensible high point, or a peak bold enough to be visible for miles in every direction. The pattern suggests something closer to a shared cultural map than a scattered set of ghost stories, a way of marking which places in the landscape carried weight beyond their obvious military or agricultural use. A hunter who avoided a particular bald mountain wasn't necessarily afraid. He was observing a boundary his whole community had already agreed was there, whether or not anyone could point to physical proof of what was on the other side of it. All of this took on a different weight after 1838, when the United States Army actually did come, and there was no invisible warning this time that gave anyone 7 quiet days to prepare. The Cherokee Nation was marched west under armed guard along what became known as the Trail of Tears, most of it in the winter of 1838 and 1839, and thousands died from exposure, disease, and starvation before it was over, a death toll historians still argue over the exact size of, because nobody in charge of the march kept careful count of the people they were marching. In the years afterward, survivors and their descendants kept returning to the same specific grief in their storytelling, not simply mourning the land or the dead, but mourning a particular kind of separation nobody else's history quite has a name for. Relatives who were understood to still exist, healthy and unaging, inside a mountain the rest of the family could no longer reach. The stories of people carried under Setsi, of Yahulah still walking home to visit, of entire townhouses lifted into Lone Peak, were not remembered as quaint anymore. They became a record of who had gotten out and who hadn't, sorted by an event nobody left behind could verify or undo. A nation that had just lost most of its physical homeland was also holding on to the belief that a small number of its own people had escaped that same catastrophe by several years, waiting inside the same mountains everyone else had just been forced to leave. Nikwasi Mound is still standing today, in the middle of what is now the town of Franklin, North Carolina, close enough to the Little Tennessee River that most of the town's daily traffic passes within sight of it. The name itself, sometimes rendered Nikwasi, translates to Star Place, and the town that once surrounded the mound appears on a map dating to the 1500s and is mentioned in colonial records as early as 1718, with a census in 1721 counting more than 160 residents. The mound itself is believed to date back nearly 1,000 years, built long before European contact, and it survived almost entirely undisturbed by archaeologists, unlike many comparable mounds excavated by Smithsonian teams in the 1880s, making it today the largest unexcavated mound of its kind in the entire southeast. It survived the 1819 land cession that first put it into non-Cherokee hands, survived more than a century of private and municipal ownership after the town of Franklin bought it in 1946, with money raised partly by local school children, and survived a 2012 incident in which a town employee sprayed herbicide across it to kill the grass, an act the Eastern Band publicly called desecration. What it could not survive was 200 years of belonging to somebody else, until this year. In January 2026, the Franklin Town Council voted unanimously to transfer the mound's deed to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and the following month the deed was formally signed over, ending more than 2 centuries during which the site associated with the spirit defenders of Nikwasi was owned by anyone except the Cherokee themselves. Plans are already underway to connect it to Cowie, a similar and even larger platform mound a few miles north across the same river, as a single interpreted corridor telling both sites' history together. The mound never stopped being sacred to the people who told these stories about it. The paperwork just took 200 years to catch up. None of this requires anyone to decide whether the Nunnehi were literally real, and the Cherokee who told these stories to Mooney never asked him to decide either. What isn't in question is that a specific, geographically consistent body of testimony was independently recorded from multiple unconnected informants describing the same mountains, the same rules, and the same events, decades before anyone thought to write it down for an outside audience. What also isn't in question is the timing. The most detailed warning stories, the ones about voices, about counting to 7 days, about a townhouse carried physically into a mountain, are all set in the years just before the actual removal, a catastrophe the storytellers had no way of predicting with that kind of specific ritual detail, unless something about the anxiety of that period was already working its way into how people explained the world around them. Nikwasi Mound stood through all of it, through cession, through purchase, through desecration, and is finally, as of this year, back in the hands of the nation that always said something was still living inside it. A researcher at Western Carolina University who has written about the mound's history called the transfer the result of decades of partnership rather than a single sudden act of generosity. And that framing matters, because nothing about this story ever moved quickly. Whatever was or wasn't in that mound, the record of who kept saying so, for how long, and under what circumstances, is no longer a footnote anyone has to go looking for.